Ja, varmt välkomna kära deltagare, riddare kring runda bordet. Vi kommer strax presentera er vilka ni är. Jättevälkomna också alla som sitter i publiken. Kul att det är så många här. Välkomna också alla som följer det här samtalet framför datorer eller vad det nu kan tänkas vara via våran live streaming. Vi ska ha ett samtal om lärandets kvalitet i en föränderlig tid. Detta långa namn på ett samtal. Men det handlar helt enkelt bara om ett försök från Tänk om sida att få igång en samtalsserie om lärande som är ämnesövergripande, som tar med upp olika discipliner i samtalet, men där också de som jobbar i skolans värld också är med på samtalet. Och jag tänker inte bli mycket mer långrandig än så, men det är det första samtalet ut och vi kommer fortsätta göra det här ett par gånger per år framöver. Nästa gång är i samband med SET-mässan i april. Men vi kör igång och jag lämnar över ordet till Patrik Hernwall från Stockholms universitet som är dagens moderator. Och du har en mikrofon så nu får jag ställa ifrån mig den här.
Tack Hans. Jag säger välkomna jag också och till panelen and then I turn to English as we have English speaking guests among us. So we will keep this conversation in English. And as most of us are by and large Swedish speaking, so we kind of help each other out when we're stuck with the languages. But here are some of Sweden's finest and some icing on the cake from New Zealand and to help us dig deeper into what are these qualities of learning. And schooling and the schooling system is an urgent issue, of course, as you all know. And it is an issue that has attended much criticism, and that we will not focus on today. Now we will focus on the qualities and the way forward. And we start this, just a few words about how we will make this evening a great evening together. We will start with the panel presenting themselves, obviously, and then we have a couple of questions that they will discuss, again, about the qualities of learning. And as a closing up of this evening, we will turn to you, the audience, and ask you for questions in the end of this 2-hour session. And hopefully some of you will also have the opportunity to try to summarize what has been said here. What are your learning experiences from this afternoon? But we will come back to that, of course. But again, welcome, and welcome all of you. Susanne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes.
Let's start.
I'm Susanne Kjällander, and I'm a doctor in didactics at Stockholm University. Last year, I wrote a doctoral thesis about children's learning in social science with digital media, such as laptops and digital cameras and different digital learning resources. And at the moment, I'm working as a researcher and a teacher educator at Stockholm University. And also I'm engaged in different research projects. Among others, there is a very interesting research project about iPads in preschools. And I think that's a very interesting thing since a lot of preschools are investing in iPads without really knowing if it's good for pupils' learning or not. My field of experience obviously is children's learning with the digital learning resources. And my interest is foremost having a child perspective. So I look at children's learning with digital resources. Yes, and also the learning that I'm looking at is you could say that it's institutionalized since it's in the school, it's framed by the school or preschool. But still, since digital media opens up between the private and the official worlds and between home and school, I also look at the more private learning. Thanks.
Thank you. Lisa.
Okay, my name is Lisa Adamson, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Gothenburg, half-time. The rest of my time I work as a school development advisor for the city of Gothenburg, mainly focused on ICT and literacy. So what I do for my studies are actually with a focus on digital literacy in one-to-one school contexts. And digital literacy is mainly, to make it as an easy explanation, is what kind of literacy, reading, writing, language use, that you mediate through a digital tool. But one other important thing with digital literacy is the focus on the social part. So these two things are the most important things when you talk about digital literacy. I'm specifically interested in when students use iPads. So I've been following a class in secondary school, a whole class using a one-to-one iPad initiative. And I'm interested to see what kind of digital literacies that the kids or the students use and how that is related to the teacher instructions. So what do the teachers say, and how is that shown or visible among the kids or the students? So that's about it. Okay?
Thank you. Martin Tallvid. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation for tonight. I think it will be 2 interesting hours. As Lisa split in two halves. One half is practitioner. I'm an upper secondary school teacher. Actually, I have been teaching today, between 8 and 11 today, at the technical program at the upper secondary school in Gothenburg. And the other half, I'm doing research as well at the University of Gothenburg, the IT faculty. And my main interest is, of course, concerning technology in the classroom, and especially the one-to-one projects that are flooding all over Sweden right now. I've been following a couple of schools in Falkenberg for a couple of years now, or maybe more than 4 years now. So, and I've written about it, as maybe some of you already have read. Thank you.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here, and my name is Anne-Marie Corling, or Schörling, and I'm a teacher, and I studied to be a teacher when I was quite old. I used to work on a music company with ABBA and all kind of artists, and I had my first class, and it took me 2 or 4 months, and I wrote my first article about changing things. I thought I was very modest, but I always think that I'm very modest. But I do have the perspective of the child, and I always ask myself if I want to be a pupil in my own classroom. And if I do have to think about that every time I'm having a class. I'm educated in New Zealand, and I brought the ideas back to Sweden. I wrote a book about it, and I have been traveling around all over Sweden since then. So I'm very happy to, yes, yeah, okay. And I got a prize, Swedish Academy prize for educating. And I invested those money in a trip to other countries to educate myself in reading, how to educate and think about reading and reading skills for children. So I'm very happy to be here. And this was my start in English, okay?
I would also like to say thank you to the organisers for being able to participate this evening. My name is Trevor Dolan. I am a doctoral student at Stockholm University, Department of Education. I also work at Karolinska Institute with a project where we're looking at how school climate affects teenagers' mental health and well-being. I come from Ireland originally, but I've lived in Sweden since 1992, and I am the product of a very good school system, but I left school with failed grades, and I started studying very late in life. I was 32 before I decided to start studying again. My interest is also very much child-centered or learner-centered. I'm interested in effective schools research, but I'm also very interested in motivation, creativity, and educational neuroscience, an area that we really need to develop here in Sweden, looking at brain research and combining it with education research. But creativity and motivation are extremely important and central to my work. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for speaking in English tonight. I would have been extremely lost without that. My name's Debra Masters, and I'm from Auckland in New Zealand. I work very closely with John Hattie. I have done so for about 12 years now. I'm a primary school teacher and a high school teacher, but I went to work in the New Zealand Government, Ministry of Education, where I managed a lot of policy around curriculum and assessment. And then I went to work with John at the University of Auckland. I've been really closely associated with the visible learning research, and I have worked with John now to take the visible learning research off those dusty shelves and actually put it into practice. So we talk about learning, not about teaching. John is going to be here tomorrow, and he's going to be talking about that as well. He's going to be talking about the research. But I was really interested to see the other day, a colleague of mine from the United States sent me a video to watch, and it was about the use of iPads in the classroom. And I opened it with great interest, only to be seriously dismayed. One of our doctoral students at the university did her PhD into what students do when they're learning to read. In her research, she discovered from all of the classroom observations that she did that when children are learning to read, the most common activity they do is colouring in, followed by cutting out things and pasting them in books. When I watched the iPad video, the children in the classroom were colouring in on their iPad. I was extremely dismayed. So that's a bit about me. I can talk a lot about the visible learning research, but it's interesting to note that John and I have been working just over the last few days, particularly focusing on the use of technology in classrooms. Many of you will know that John's research has been pulling together whole lots of meta-analyses, about 250 million students in that research base now. We do have information in the meta-analysis in the visible learning research around the use of technology, but at the moment we're in the process of breaking it down further so we can actually break down the actual effects of things like the use of iPads, flipped classrooms, things like that in the classroom. That research is going to be out at the end of next year, which I'm sure will stimulate yet more discussion. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here.
Well, I think I should also thank for the invitation, as everyone else has been doing. It's nice to be here, and I hope we will have an interesting discussion during the evening. My name is Ulf Fredriksson, and I'm Associate Professor in Education at work at the Institute of International Education, which is a part of the Department of Education at Stockholm University. And it's a part that deals with international comparative education. So one of my interests is to compare countries, to look into differences. My other area of interest is related to reading. I've been working quite a lot with reading. I'm also responsible for the Swedish part of the PISA study on reading, and I will working with the study on digital reading that was published 2011, and I'm presently working with an in-depth analysis of the data we have from the PISA study on digital reading in Sweden, looking into what are the differences between traditional reading and digital reading, and what kind of differences can we see between different students. And I think I'll stop there. I can say a lot of other things, but I'll save it for the discussion.
Do the switch here. That. Thank you so much. My name is Agneta Gurlz, and I am a professor of cognitive science. I work at Lund and Linköping's universities.
where I direct a research and development group called the Educational Technology Group. And I want several things for school and learning, but I'll just mention a few now. First, I want a novel focus on assessment. Assessment that is integrated with pedagogical work, and not assessment that competes with it. And here, education and technology can be a key factor. There's much talk of 21st century skills, and I want to see a corresponding discussion about 21st century assessment. And second, I want good educational software for school, and there is an immense potential, but very little is realized. And Sweden is unfortunately quite in the back line, a little bit the cousin from the countryside. If you say that in English too, kusinen från landet, unfortunately. Third, I want to see even more focus on production and production in collaboration in learning activities. Maybe I'll say something more, I'll probably say more about that later. Now, as a research leader, and then I'm also dealing with master students, both in cognitive science and engineering students, I have my fingers in many jam jars. Pies. Okay. Jam pies. Oh, pies. I have my finger in pies. We say in syltburken, in the jam jar. Yeah. But in the pies, I have my fingers a bit everywhere. So I mean, we are all over the ages, from the very small ones and then up to, of course, also university level, since I am a teacher there myself. But lately, I am pretty much working with the very small kids, actually. And that is my fourth point. About math, I'm convinced that the most important thing to do there is really to go for preschool. It's too late to start to do this, you know, in school, the 3 to 5 year olds. So.
Hello, I would like to say thank you for inviting me. My name is Anna-Kaja, and I am also a teacher, mostly. I do work at Stockholm University as well. I work at the National Center for Swedish as a Second Language, because I work mostly with students or learners with Swedish as a second language, and mostly new arrivals. I truly believe that language is the key to learning and knowledge, and I truly believe that we have to, as teacher, I mean, work with methods that addresses language and literacy issues across the curriculum, all of us. And that's what I do, try to do every day. And I write a bit about it as well, and I read a lot. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Obviously, each is worthy of at least 2 hours for themselves. This will be rather hard, I think. I will recapitulate the 3 questions here, I think, and then I will give the word to Trevor, because you used some of the key concepts from the from one of the questions, and you're obviously rather comfortable in speaking English, so that will be kind of a good start, I think. But please remember that the knowledge that we create is something that we create together here, of course. So let's keep the dialogue going. But again, the 3 questions about related to what is qualities of learning. The 3 questions are how to foster motivation and creativity in the school. And you mentioned the 2 words, motivation and creativity. When is the best situation for learning? And technology and learning, how do they relate to each other? Rather big questions, don't you think? If there is anyone that can answer this, it's this panel. And you will be enlightened here, I think. So please, Trevor, about the first question. And given your background, as you spoke about your relationship towards elementary school and what happened there, how to foster motivation and creativity in school?
First and foremost, we need teaching in schools, or a climate in school that it makes kids interested, where it has relevance for them, and hopefully where it's fun to learn. Motivation, if we look at neural research, has to do with feelings, emotions. And it's the same for all of us. When we really feel that, wow, this is interesting, this I want to read more about, then we open ourselves up to learning. But we don't do that in education. We tell kids to sit down, be quiet, and I'm going to tell you what's interesting and what you need to know. That doesn't create motivation. To hop forward to ICT in education, we don't know yet, but I would imagine that the interface with technology triggers dopamine in the brain in our young people, and they spend a lot of time at their computers or their iPads or whatever at home at the weekends, and so their brain is rewarding them with dopamine, and then they're coming into school and the brain is screaming for more dopamine, and it's not getting it because it's not interesting. It doesn't relate to their life outside school, what they're doing in school. And it really wouldn't be very difficult for us to do that, to make it interesting and relevant for them. Creativity, children are creative. There's an awful lot of talk about how we can foster and nurture and create creativity in our children. Children are creative. Studies have shown that divergent thinking amongst 3-year-olds is incredibly high. And yet after only 5 years in school, that ability for divergent thinking, seeing a lot of different ways of solving a problem, has disappeared. And by 25, the age of 25, it's virtually gone. Because we learn in schools that there's one way of solving a problem. So small children are creative. And I think Sir Ken Robinson is quite right when he says we educate our children out of their creative capacities. We simply don't understand children enough. And since I've started working with brain research and started learning about the brain of small children, I mean, there's 50% more brain activity in a 4-year-old than there is in an adult. They can learn so much more than we can imagine. But I would warn here, that does not mean that our politicians should translate that as meaning we need to make preschool more like school. I would say it's the complete opposite. We need to make school more like preschool, because preschools foster creativity, motivation in our children. I could go on and on about it, but I'll leave it at that for now.
I'm going to leave it to Martin. Of some reason, these are the people that want to speak right now. There is much creativity at this end of the table. But Martin, please.
Maybe I'd like to take it back one step, because if you're talking about motivation, you need a definition of what you really mean with motivation. And there's been a long debate about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And intrinsic is good, extrinsic is bad. And this is what we speak about when we commonly speak about motivation. But the thing is that it's not as easy as that. Research show that extrinsic motivation can be as good as intrinsic. There are different kinds of extrinsic motivation, and the good ones are as good as the intrinsic ones. And I think if you, like me, teach students like between 16 and 18 years old, you can never expect them to be intrinsic motivated all the time. You have to do some extrinsic motivation. And as in every question we talk about tonight, it comes down to the teacher, I think. If it's a good teacher, they can motivate the kids to do a good work, even if they're not intrinsic motivated.
Okay, to me, motivation is very closely connected to how we put out real-world problems in school. issues and problems that really get into the hearts of the students. And sometimes I think that the new curriculum we have becomes to some teachers a bit of a risk when it comes to this, because there is so much content. There's so much things that you have to cover. And in that situation, it might end up that you sort of limit yourself even more to your subject. While the most important thing here is to lift your eyes and put everything together and see it as a cross-curriculum thing, where you put all the subjects together and work together. And I wrote down a few questions that I think would cover lots of the goals we have and the content we need to work with. Like if you say to the kids to work with real-world problems, and you say to them, explain, you give a few questions to say, explain why you chose this and what you think about that, justify it, and also evaluate the ideas you have. And one question could be, what is the current relationship between Hamas and Israel? And how did it become like that? I mean, how many things wouldn't you be able to cover just starting with a question that is up to date, something they see every day on the news? Another one could be, you have 10,000 kroner to donate to a hunger relief program. Choose one, and also choose a country where you find that one. And evaluate, justify, and explain why you chose that. Another thing could be read the terms and conditions of Facebook and summarize the key ideas. Just thinking about that idea, something you use every day. Most of us doesn't know, we don't have a clue what is behind, right? So that is one very meaningful thing. And another thing, if they're a bit older, the kids, you could say, what are the top-rated jobs in Sweden? And what required skills do these jobs have in common? I'm sure that all these 4 questions would cover so much things, and it will be something very close to the kids' hearts and their ideas about life.
But how do you assess it?
Take that another day.
I would just like to make a comment to your talk about preschool as being more creative than school. And my research is in preschools and schools, and it shows that if we go back to the Swedish preschool, it's always explained as something as a good pedagogy, especially abroad, that the Swedish preschool model is very good in different ways. And one of those things is that the preschool teacher and the kids are exploring together. It's not just the kids exploring, but also the teacher, the preschool teacher, is exploring as well. And in my research, I could actually see that the teachers in a digital environment were exploring too. They were not just trying to transfer their knowledge to the kids. Instead, they didn't have this knowledge monopoly that we always say that teachers have in the classroom. Instead, they were exploring together. And that I could see actually made it possible for the kids to be more creative, even though they were not preschool kids anymore, but they were actually in upper secondary school or high school or something like that. So I just want to say that because it's interesting in the digital environment.
Yeah. I could add to that, being a preschool teacher myself, I think it's very important, and I think this shortly, Anne-Marie, but focusing, as you said, Trevor, on the children and their creativity, and learn from them being humans, not just children. They are humans as well. We can learn very much about ourselves, I think, and not regarding them as something else in that way. But it wasn't me that wanted to speak, it was Anne-Marie. Sorry.
No, but I think the questions you raised here is a question that I want to join in. And I think all the time we do something in the classroom, we shall do it as an idea that we join together, not this is what you should do and this is what you should do, and I'm in the middle looking at what you are doing, and then I tell, well, that's, you could take that off or something. You have to join and you have to do things together. So questions like this, children always ask questions, and they they are big. So if you daily write down what kind of questions children ask, you can build a curriculum around a question. And I would love to do, that's the way I do it, because I think I put fat questions by the door in my classroom when they were going out, and I couldn't get them from the fat questions to my small questions. So I changed the idea in the classroom. So fat questions that we have to look for the answers together. I don't know, and they don't know, and we do just go into it together. And I would love to have something that I don't know anything about, in a language I don't know anything about, to be together with the children to find out what will this be. So I have to be creative as well. I have to be brave to be a teacher, I guess, to do this. Mm-hmm. Someone?
Let's move to the other end of the table here. Ulf wanted to say something. And what are your thoughts so far?
Well, I think we need to reflect upon how do you become creative? I mean, if we think it's important that children should become creative, that we should become creative, we should be creative, how do you become creative? Do you become creative by having an hour of creativity, or do you become creative by doing other things in a creative way? And are the things you need to know in order to be creative? And I think we probably need to realize that there are things we need, the instruments, there are skills we need to have to be creative. And I mean, we can't get away, I mean, that may be very old-fashioned, but I think we can't get away from the old basic skills. And in my case, of course, reading is important. To be creative, you have to be able to read. You could be creative without being able to read, but if you have the ability to read and if you get the skills to read, that makes you even easier to be more creative. So I think we need to see that we give children the skills and the instruments they need in order to further develop the activities. And then I think it's also important to reflect upon, I mean, sometimes we talk about the school is so boring and then we should do fun things in schools. But should school do things because they're funny? I don't think school should do things because they're funny. I think school should do things because they're important and because they're important things to learn. But they should try to do it in an interesting and a funny way. But that's a different angle. You start with what you think is important for children to learn. You try to make that interesting, funny, but you don't start another way around saying this is funny things, we just do that. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah. Anna, what do you think about creativity and learning and languages, as you spoke about before?
I would like to start with the children coming to school. I think we have to value and work with their knowledge and their backgrounds. And I know in Sweden today we live in a multicultural society. We have a multilingual society, and it's a great resource for learning and learning new things that maybe me as a normal Swedish teacher, maybe I don't know how my students' cultural background affect their learning. And I think I have to find out and I have to work with it. And I see a lot of problems. We see those children as problems. It's a problem they don't know Swedish. We could see it as a resource that I have a potential bilingual student here, and this learner can also teach me and the other students a lot of things. And I think that if we value what children bring to school, that's a good way to start.
Well, I would like to go back to the comment you made first up, and that was about the idea that kids, you know, spend their weekend doing computer games and they're full of dopamine. Why can't we continue that on a Monday and a Tuesday and a Wednesday and a Thursday and a Friday? And how can we go about doing that? And I think we do our kids a bit of a disservice, really, because the reason kids like computer games is because it's telling them where they're going, it's giving them the goal. Where are we going? We're going to the next level. And then when I get there, I'm going to go to the next level. It gives us instant feedback on the way through. It tells us how we're doing. We get it all the time. And when we get to that next level, it tells us where to go to next. Now, if we created our classrooms, and in the work that we do, we don't think about the what of the classroom, we think about the how of the classroom. If we had our kids coming to school and they knew in every lesson where they were going, we were giving them feedback about how they were doing, and then we were telling them where to go to next, they would be so much more self-directed in their learning. But for many kids, they come into our classrooms and they do what the teacher said. Often they think that learning is sitting up straight on the mat, doing what the teacher said. But if we were actually structuring our learning in such a way that the kids knew every moment of the day, I know where I'm going, I know how I'm doing, I know where to next, then they're going to actually have that dopamine. They're actually going to be really actively involved. And as John's research shows, you can actually get 2 to 3 years of progress for a student in 1 year, 2 to 3 years of progress in 1 year by kids being active participants in their learning. And I think we just need to be far more deliberate rather than guess what's in my head, I am the teacher, therefore you sit and listen, and being really purposeful about what kids are doing. I don't think it really matters at that stage. I mean, it does matter what the content is, but the way that we actually do it, we just get our kids engaged. I was in a classroom a couple of weeks ago, and this particular school has a time of the week that's called breakthrough time. And breakthrough is when they're doing something going beyond the limits. It's their kind of free choice, and they work in groups. And this group of boys were sitting there, and I sat down beside them. I said, "Oh, what are you doing in breakthrough?" And they said, "We're doing CGI." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And they said, "We don't know, that's why we're doing it." But they had that really clear framework for what it was they were doing, because I think one of the dangers with the inquiry-based learning that seems to be so popular these days is that often kids, we don't give them the structure and the entry points into that learning. So we need to be really explicit about that. But I think we can do the dopamine. I think we just need to be really clear about how we do it.
Yeah. Agneta, what do you think about this? You've been working with pedagogic
work
software.
With dopamine. So I agree, we can go for dopamine. And one of the most motivating things is actually to get feedback on whether or that you are developing, you are making progress. So one way of creating, or what was the question was to foster, can we foster motivation and creativity? Well, that is to focus much more on formative assessment, because that is focused on development and how are you doing and what are you doing well and why, and what is not so good and why, and how can you get better, how can you develop. And again, digital or educational, I should say, software has a large potential here. That is one of the things I would like to put in, and then I have 2 others. You can foster motivation and creativity by creating situations where people can use their productive agency. And this is a term that I've borrowed from my collaborator at School of Education in Stanford, and I will explain what that means. Basically, it's most pronounced when you have a small group working together in a productive task. So you produce something. Now this, of course, has to be different things, different ages. But say it can be an essay, it can be a film, it can be a talk, it can be, I think you had some problems that you brought in. I think those can be, the kind of tasks. You produce something. You do this together. And there's a high degree of inclusion of others' ideas. Integration of ideas is very important. And so this means you can all be productive and you're an agent. And this appears to be very motivating as such. It's probably very deep roots for this. Why it is so motivationally strong. I mean, you do get feedback on what you are doing. You see your input, your ideas being transformed, made use of course also criticized, but it's very important that the climate is a friendly one, so that you dare bring out your ideas. And I guess this also brings me then to my third it relates to this one. I think it's very important to have a productive, positive view of mistakes, so that, you know, mistakes, failures, this is something we can learn from. And that is something that you can work on quite much in an educational setting, to be more learning-oriented and not performance-oriented. Mistakes, all that happens along, is very important also to learn from.
Trevor. Trevor, you have some...
But learning is making mistakes and developing. I think the problem is that we tell children to do things. We tell children to do things, and as they do things, we tell them this is wrong, and how to be creative when someone is looking over your shoulder and telling you you're not doing the proper thing here. You should write like this, and you should use this, and you should. I think that we have to have a lot of works that children do, and to show them their, you know, the way you did this and you did this, and could you tell me what's the difference? You talk about the work, not make marks on them, and we do a lot of marking on children's work. So how could they dare to be creative? Yeah.
That last point reminds me of Sugata Mitra, his research, where he talks about that what children really need is, like, was he called it the grandmother model? There's somebody who's standing behind them saying, wow, that was interesting. How did you do that? Show me that again. Which also goes back to motivation and the whole idea of what sort of praise can be harmful or praise can be good. You know, giving praise to kids for what they've done, how they've done it, is much better than giving them praise for something they are. It's quite interesting, like a lot of what we're talking about here, Seymour Papert was writing about this stuff back in the 1980s. Definitely. And we're still here talking about it. And he was able to demonstrate how joint action was so positive. And there was some recent research in brain neuroscience that was published just a couple of months ago that showed the amount of oxygen in the brain, the amount of brain activity, when we work together, joint action, which you were talking about, collaborative working in classrooms. There's an awful lot of activity going on in the brain. Solo activity, when the kids are sitting there quietly reading or whatever, there's not so much happening. And then when people are sitting like you are now, just listening, it's basically flatline. There's very little happening at all. But you know, we need, I think, more collaborative work, and Papert was able to show also in the early 1980s that getting kids sitting around a computer together, solving mathematical problems, and why not, you know, which he was also into, teach them programming. We never ever discussed that, teaching the computer programming in education. So a lot of what we're talking about, we talk of the title for the discussion this evening is about in a time of change. Human society has always been in a time of change. There's nothing unique about this time. And we talk about this as an information age. Human societies have always been information societies. It's just that we have new ways of accessing that. So I think that somehow, you know, Papert was way ahead of his time, and we're still talking about the same thing. How do we move it forward? Because I think we all seem to be in agreement here. I do wonder about what you're saying about your self-determination theory, Ryan, and to see this with extrinsic and intrinsic. Yeah. Extrinsic, it depends on, I think, on how you translate it. If you translate it as reward, then we have a huge problem. Yeah. Because as soon as you tell anyone, whether they're a child or an adult, if you do what I want you to do, I'm going to give you this reward. Then they'll do exactly what you want them to do and nothing more. And then you run the risk of getting a very, very shallow learning rather than depth. And we are currently doing our teenagers in particular, I think, a big disservice. When you look at synapse density in the brain, it's at its height in preschool. There's an awful lot going on there. It's reached its absolute bottom around the age of 15, 16. That's the age when we're telling kids, you got to pull yourself together, you've got to have another attitude, you've got to take responsibility for your own learning. At a time when, I mean, you look at this as well. I mean, teenagers make decisions that are very emotional and it's perfectly understandable from a biological perspective. So that we need to get much more of that knowledge, I think, into education.
The strange thing is that we know pretty much, as you say, about this. We know pretty much about what learning is and how learning appears and stuff like that. Still, we have the schooling system. And there is schooling and learning could be rather different things, I think. At least in terms of what is creativity and what is motivation.
But we can't get away from the fact that what you were into, there are certain tools you need.
Yeah.
And language, as Anna was saying, that is so incredibly important. Yeah. If you don't have the language, how are you going to express yourself? We need language up here to be able to think. Yes. So there are certain tools that we need to have. Yeah. Then it's how we use those, or how we have used those tools, traditional education, that we can maybe need to think in new ways.
Yeah. Lisa wanted to say something. I know you have something interesting to say.
Okay. I want to just go back a little bit, back to the formative assessment and creativity. And I want to just throw out a question to the rest of the panel here, especially to those who still teach. Because one of the things I've seen in some of my material and my research is that you see traces of the document culture we live in. Everything is supposed to be documented. And what you can see when it comes to teacher instructions and what the students choose to do and how they do it is very much based on text. So I was just thinking that how can we get away from that? I mean, if the students have the possibility to show their knowledge through using videos, radio broadcasting, all kinds of things, social media, whatever, but they still very much choose to use keynote presentations or PowerPoints. So what do you think about that? How can we sort of get through that, and what is needed to change that kind of culture that we have when it comes to assessment?
I think that's a question for you, Anna.
Yeah. I think it's very important that the students in school have to use or to show their skills in a lot of different ways. As it comes to documentary, how I document their progress and their learning, I use a lot of video recording, and it's quite interesting to see how the students, after a couple of months, are listening to themselves and looking and say, wow, my language has increased so much. I'm so much better in Swedish now. It's a very useful tool. But I think that about texts, do you mean like written text? Yeah, because I think in the school today, if I look at teaching, the planning I do as a teacher, we normally plan for our writing and reading, but are we planning for the way we talk to our students? Are we planning the way how the kind of questions we're going to use? I think we have to work more with how we talk to each other, because I don't know who, but someone said that it's in the talk between the educator and the teacher or the student that education occurs or fails. And I think that's quite important.
Agneta, please.
I would like to go back. I like your the feedback approach to say, first of all, that this is interesting, or now you have an interesting suggestion for an answer, or this is an interesting idea. But on the other hand, in order to have development and progress, sometimes there has to come in the, not phrase it like negative feedback, but rather perhaps that there is at least a choice. There is a choice between this or this solution, this or this idea. And why I think, or I also know from my own experience, that the collaboration in the small groups that really produce something together, there it comes more naturally, of course, because we are together producing something. So of course you have your idea, you have your idea, you have your idea, but we have to kind of decide which one shall we go for, can we integrate them? And that is, so in that sense you do get feedback. Your maybe not the most appropriate or the most promising in this context. Yeah, I could go on about assessment too, but maybe someone, or what was the question you got? Or I lost myself. Somebody else.
No, but sorry. Okay. I'm not telling that you shouldn't, you have to produce something, but teachers are afraid of their own, you know, my student doesn't do things very well. I have to tell them to do better, and they don't samla ihop, gather a lot of works to look at what development is happening here. They do it immediately on the same work that children makes, and I think I wouldn't in that situation. I wouldn't be creative or wanting to give something away. I need to get feedback and feed forward. So, and we give, well, we have to give more. It's, yeah, yeah.
Susanne, actually, I think you was into this preschool thing again. Am I wrong?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. Then I can learn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No problem. No, we were actually, I don't know who was most talking about this, that pupils, in order to get creative, they need to express themselves in different signs or different ways. I think it was you, Anna. And in my research material, I see a lot of pupils working with PowerPoints. And when they work with these PowerPoints, I think it's so interesting to see, because I'm filming the pupils so I can actually look at the films over and over again and watch it in details. And then I can see that they are not working so hard with the texts in the PowerPoint, but they are putting a lot of engagement in choosing a perfect image. They want to have a background that sort of motivates how you see the facts that they are displaying. For example, I have an example when pupils are working with the prisons, and they put a lot of energy in. They want a dark background, they want music to sort of make you feel like it's so awful to sit in a prison, and then make this headline which is very dramatic and everything. And then they just cut and paste some text. They don't care so much about it. And while the pupils are working with this, the teachers sometimes come and they give this formative feedback, and they say, oh, that's good and interesting, and all this. Yeah, it's like what we've been talking about with feedback. But in the end, when they present the work and when the pupils are getting assessed with the grade, it's only the text. So the teacher, in the end of a subject area, and it's just the text that is assessed with the grade. And that's a big problem, which I can see in my thesis, because it's not something wrong with the teacher. It's not that, because the teacher is aware of all these different signs that the pupil want to express themselves with. But we don't have, it's not written in the assessment grades and everything. We don't have the language for assessing, for example, how a pupil is using colors or layout or sounds. And that's so sad, because these kids, they are so used to using this different kind of languages or signs or whatever you would call it. And so it's so natural for them to express themselves and express their learning in those kind of signs. But we have to find tools to write that. And at the moment, we don't.
So is that a restriction in your curriculum and assessment program you're talking about? That you can't assess colour and image?
It's not really supposed to be like that, because we're talking about this widened expression of vidgade textbegreppet. I don't know what you call that in English, but a broader concept of text. It's written in the curriculum and it's written in the goals and everything. But when it comes to actually writing assessment criteria for a specific subject area,
not included.
I'm not sure why, but it's not.
It is documentation culture that I was talking about.
Probably.
I think that is an issue there.
Yeah, it's easier to assess text than music.
Yeah.
Yeah, Martin, please.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting because I think the country's school system is never better than the assessment system. So if you really want to change school and teaching, you must start with the assessment system, because this is exactly what you're talking about. You can talk a lot about nice words about creativity and 21st century skills, but as we are tied behind our backs with the assessment system, that you have to provide a grade for doing this and that, you can't be as creative as you want as a teacher, I think.
And I guess I come from a really different system where that creativity, I'm really surprised to hear what you're saying, because certainly in New Zealand, even with our qualifications, all of that would be part of the assessment. Even in dance, drama, everything would be based on the performance and what you've done. So that would be a real restriction for you if it's not able to be assessed. And I'm quite surprised at that. Yeah.
Yeah, hot topic indeed. Not everyone wants to speak. Agneta first. Then we take it through the Trevor, Maria, and Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, I guess everybody, or basically everybody, at least here, agrees that there is a problem with the focus on the summative assessment, because it does put learning in a black box. I mean, there is a learning process going on. That is what we are mostly interested in. But it's more like you came here and there's no concern about how did you get here. And I am excited about the possibilities that there are actually in learning technology here. Because you can build educational games that can also be built as assessing instruments. Because what you do when you play an educational game is that you make choices all the time. And the system can log this, and you can log the choices that are of interest then for a teacher or an evaluator. So besides, of course, getting your final results, you also get information about how motivated a student is to learn, how they respond to feedback in different forms, how they respond to change, what choices they actually make when there is nobody telling them, what to choose. So we can see development over time. Somebody said that you get actually the ethnographer's thick description for free here. And the most important point is that this is integrated then, because they play a good educational game. We can follow learning as it occurs, but also give feedback to them, support them. They learn. We can see how they respond to this. So you have an integration of the teaching, learning, the pedagogical work, and assessment, and not competing for time like today. And to mention the 21st century skills, actually what you can see also here is students, whether they can take a responsibility for their own learning. This is one of the skills. How can you assess that with standard assessment? Or, their inclinations, their capacity to learn, whether they are able to plan their own learning. All these are things that you can get information about. But, of course, it's not like you can just take an educational game and do this, because you have to build it in the way that it does log things, what is interesting, and it has to summarize this so that it provides you with this information. Development over time, at critical points, what do students do, what kind of moments are the most difficult for them, how do they respond to feedback, how do they collaborate with others? There are lots of information. And we are actually building some of our games right now that can also be used then as assessment tools, but much more interesting assessment tools, in my view. And also not putting the student in this situation, now we have the test. You play this over time, a long time. This is just normal activity in school. I'm doing this. There is a purpose of this. And at the same time, I can follow and I can assess interesting things.
I think the thing that would worry me about that would be, is the teacher actually using that information? How is the teacher using that information? Because we've built a number of assessment tools, John Hattie and myself at the university, and one very major one for the New Zealand education system, and also a whole set of digital learning objects, which do a lot of that kind of tracking. But what we found was the teachers weren't using the information. It was there for them, but they have to be really motivated to actually use it.
Yeah, but I don't think we should just, be satisfied with that, because then the systems have not been produced in the way. I'm absolutely convinced that you can do that, but you have to involve teachers also in what is it they want, what is important for them, and that the format has to be very, it should be easy to use also. You can log everything, and many of these systems, they just provide teachers with lots of information. They don't want to use it. But I can see
We found with the digital learning objects, teachers weren't using that information very well. But with another assessment tool that we built, we actually built it using backward design. So we actually went to, what is the information that you would find useful about your students? What is information that students would find useful about their learning? And we actually looked at that. So we actually workshopped that with lots of kids, lots of teachers, lots of parents as well. And then when we knew the kind of information they wanted, we went back to the university and designed the tool that would actually give that information. Now that information is feedback. We actually see it primarily as being feedback to the teacher about how well you've taught. And that's a big mind shift. That's a very big mind shift. The only reason you should assess kids is to get feedback about your teaching. That's the primary reason for it. And that tool, teachers use that because it's very easy for them to follow, and they've been part of that design process. The digital learning objects were never so successful, and it's interesting to know why.
In educational games.
Well, no, the digital learning objects were educational games. Yes, they were, very much so, yeah. But I mean, it may have shifted now, but yeah, it's a
Anne-Marie, what are your thoughts here?
Sorry.